Matthew, as I was preparing for this interview, I saw a talk of yours and I heard you saying things like techno-progressivism, and I heard you mentioning just these kinds of future thoughts. And I thought, my gosh, you're so on the money. This is exactly the kinds of things we needed to be talking about. I watched this this year in 2020. Do you know when this talk was from? It was from 2014. And I thought, oh my gosh, what you were saying in 2014 is exactly what the conversation is around 2020. So I just kind of wanted to open with that. Tell us a little bit about this essential word that's kind of become synonymous with you of techno-progressivism. So over to you. Tell us a little bit about what that means.
Sure. Well, techno-progressivism it's almost a religion amongst people who work in the technology field and at least in the innovation field. And it's a belief that all technological developments will, in the end, benefit society. So right now you see a lot of backlash with social media and people saying that these companies are too big, they've become monopolies, and that they're harming people's mental health, and that we have to regulate them. And I'm not saying that that's not important. I think regulation is an important part of society and of governance and of sustainable development. But the techno-progressivist position is that we need to work through these issues. We don't say get rid of this technology because it's causing harm right now, but to look at the bigger picture and see that most technological developments, they're not good or evil, they are what they are, and that they will in the end benefit society.
And which of all of that do you most connect with? Which of that religious idea that you mentioned is most resonant to you?
Well, I was very early on this bandwagon, even before there was a lot of nomenclature for it. I started building web pages in the early 1990s. I mean, before it was a business and before it was an industry. I just really geeked out on it because it really spoke to an earlier interest in human psychology. And well, do you know the psychology of Carl Jung, Jungian psychology?
Yes.
And so he developed this idea of a gestalt, that we're all connected into a global consciousness. And when I started doing internet relay chat and all these types of very early internet, using these early internet technologies, I really felt like I was becoming part of this emerging neural network, this global brain. So to me, it was always something very inspirational, and I don't want to say spiritual, but it is in that sense, that this whole idea, this awe of connecting to the universe, and at least humans connecting together in a more efficient way and in a more real way. To me, it was very, very positive, and to me, it was very much that kind of ethos of techno-progressivism.
And this kind of maybe is in the bridge. And as I was researching the brands and the products and the services, or some more products that you've built, is that you describe your products not necessarily as your acclaimed watch or the belt that you mentioned that you're most proud of, but you describe your products simply as the materialization of these kind of ideas or this ethos. Maybe is that then how that connects? And then if that's the case, tell us a little bit about those products and what you call not a lifestyle brand but a mind style brand.
Well, I believe that one of the reasons I started my brand NOOKA, I mean, it's now on hiatus, that's another story, was to bring like this whole revolution of thought that happened with interactive technology and web technology, and bringing the whole idea of product design to the screen and interaction design, and actually designing how people behave. I felt that the same type of thinking should be applied to physical objects as well. So I felt a frustration that people demand technological and design development and evolution in their electronics and their technology products, but they don't demand it in their everyday objects. You know, so that was basically the motivation for doing it. And that's why when I talk about, you know, when I would never call the product, when people would say, oh, well, you're the watch guy. And I would say, no, I'm not the watch guy. The watch is actually just an expression of passive intelligent interface design. That can we express a concept idea without words, without numbers. So in that sense, the form that that concept took at that particular point in time and with the available technology was a watch. I mean, if I was on the West Coast and started it a little bit later, my intention was for it to be wearable technology. But that's the problem of being a little bit too early with some of these ideas in the market.
And for
But
anyone
I
that,
do believe, yeah.
I was just going to say, for anyone that hasn't seen your watch, it's like a bar approach. So instead of the number 8, there's 8 bars, for example, that then represent 8 o'clock. So when you're wondering how does a watch look like with no numbers, that's it's like blocks, isn't it? And a block represents an hour time.
Well, that goes back to one of my main core drivers of as a designer or as an innovator or an inventor is universal language. I believe that, and this has become unpopular for various reasons. You know, people always point to Esperanto as this giant failure. And it was a failure because it was so Eurocentric. You know, the whole idea to do this universal language and base it on Latin is kind of ridiculous, right? But just because that was a failure doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking for a global language. And I feel that that's what drives everything that I do.
Yeah.
And, you know, the whole idea of monoculture now is, people are just so against it. It's people miss where monoculture benefits society and where multiculturalism benefits society. And it becomes a very emotionally fraught discussion for so many people. So I decided to tell those stories via design. You know, instead of engaging people's, you know, the frontal cortex and have them argue with me about these concepts.
Right. So you just kind of like just jump to the solution rather than kind of like having to, you know, fight through all those like identity barriers and what does this mean for me and how, you know, and like kind of all of those vulnerabilities. You just said, okay, let's get to the core of this, which is maybe what is it that you want, you know, from this design or whatever, and you delivered it. One of the things that came up with you when I was first researching you was the concept of language, and not necessarily, and we're not talking about, you know, English or Japanese. We're talking about a different kind of linguistics, and this this for me has been, I would say, as I started to learn more about your work, I kind of understood linguistics at a much deeper level than I really ever have. And I speak 3 languages, and I hadn't thought about linguistics and language like I had as you'd presented it. You know, and it kind of came out. There's a few things. I think one is that I'd love if you would just share a little bit about how you actually developed a new language for numbers. I'd love if you could just share that quickly. And then also let's kind of like open this conversation now, which is really that the idea behind linguistics and the research that you've done and the insights and the patterns that you see between linguistics and essentially all the other things of technology, design, and innovation. So tell us a little bit about that.
So one of the things that inspired me to take a deeper dive into design as language and also to explore design as something more important to communicate than just something that was aesthetic was in the early 90s, I read one of Michio Kaku's first books. He's a Japanese-American physicist. And in one of the intro chapters, he was talking about how people were attacking him about his research about string theory. And he said that the argument that people always gave about string theory is that, well, you can't test it. And he wrote in this chapter that you can't test that the sun is, you know, a hydrogen reactor. We don't have the technology to send a spaceship to the sun and take a sample, right? But no one doubts that the sun is burning hydrogen. Everyone accepts that from the various tools that we have for analyzing the reality that we know, that the sun is, you know, there's a hydrogen reactor. And he made a more realistic, down-to-earth example. He said that people tend to get locked in this idea of what they think their reality is. And the example he gave was geometry. He said that everyone is forced to study Euclidean geometry in school. Like you learn the area of a triangle, you have an equation, or the area of a circle or a sphere. And he said, you think that that's how you can describe the world. He said, but when you draw a triangle on a basketball, the equation doesn't work.
Yeah.
The equations don't work with curves on 3D surfaces, and the world is a 4D world. It's not a 2D world. But and he said that, well, there's another geometry by this German mathematician, I think it was from the 19th century, called Riemann geometry, and they have equations that explain and can describe geometry of the world, like the real world, like everything, like drawing a triangle or a square on a basketball, for example, or more complex organic shapes. And he's like, well, why don't they teach this? It's like they just assume that people are too stupid to understand it. But it's really not that more complicated than Euclidean geometry. But the whole point that really blew my mind was like, wait a minute, how come I didn't know this? Yeah. You know, there's another language, there's another set of vocabulary, even within mathematics, for describing the real world. And that got me thinking more about, I'm sorry, this is going to get so academic, this particular blog post, but it got me more into thinking about like time, and time is base 12, and geometry is base 12, or base, you know, you use 45, you know, well, it's like base 60, but still 12, it's divisible by 12. But then everything else that you do with math is base 10, only because we have 10 fingers. 10. Yeah. Right. So base 10 is not an efficient system for math, because you have so many decimal points. It's just a very clumsy system. And as soon as you do math in base 12 or in higher bases, which a lot of physicists do, then the math gets a lot easier to handle the numbers. So I thought, okay, that's really interesting. So everything about, at the same time, I also read a book by Malcolm Gladwell, where he was studying this idea that Asians, he also had a chapter that people think that Asians are better at math, and that if you're a racist, you think it's genetic. But when they did studies, they found that it's linguistic. It's that in English, and not just English, French or Spanish, the word for 11, 12, 13, 14 is the same as 20, 30, 40, 50. The sounds, the difference, especially in English, is very, very minutely different. So linguistically, like in English, when you say 12 or 20, the sound that represents the 2 and the sound that represents the 10 is in the same place. Yeah. So in Japanese or Chinese or Hindi, you know, 10, like 12 is ju ni and 20 is ni ju. So the placement of the 2 and the 10 are exactly as you would write it in the equation. So a child's brain doesn't have to reconcile, wait a minute, 12 and 20 and 13 and 30, they sound the same. Like when you say it, 1330, it's the same word. And for your brain, your young brain, to try to sort this out, it just takes more time. Yeah. So by the time someone who's speaking a Western language is in high school, then their brain gets really good and very fast at doing this calculation internally. So it's not about the genetic ability of the person, it's about the language, how the language affects the way that the math is processed in the brain. So somehow these all like became like this whole, literally like a brainstorm in my brain. And I started thinking about, well, how as a designer, how can we help rationalize? Can we create a new and better language for math? And then by extension, can we create a new and better language for other complex concepts, like a more universal way?
Right. And to bring that back, maybe, and this is kind of where I'd like to also lead to know more about, because there's so much that as I was researching and learning more about your work and what you do, I just have so many questions. So I have to really prioritize what I'd like to know. So, but you're currently a professor at Keio University. Yes. Can you talk to us a little bit about, is that the kind of work that you're doing now, or has the work developed since then, or what's your current topics that you're working on in Keio?
Well, that's work I want to do, but because it's a grad school, the work that my researchers or that my master's students want to do, that's basically the work that we do. But the theme of my research lab has evolved to be more about, see, at the time when I was doing NOOKA and that concept, to me, that it's still very important to me. But I think that the world we really have a crisis now with the environment and about how businesses and how design and how products are treated, how they're viewed in society. So I've been doing more of a circular design process with my own work. And then I decided, after doing the research lab for a year or so, that perhaps focusing on circular design was more important. So right now, the lab is focusing on more on circular design processes. We're still doing the visual linguistics as well, though.
Can you tell us a little bit what circular design is for? Is that human-centered design? Is that also what you refer to human-centered design, or what's circular design?
It's not human-centered design. It's circular design is to look at the whole ecosystem of a product. So like right now, when a lot of designers, when they think of creating products that are better for the environment, a lot of the information that's out there is purely about, oh, well, is this material, the process to make it, is it toxic? Can it be recycled? But circular design is to look at something completely holistically and think, okay, how can we design this product so that it has the lowest impact on the environment from the very beginning? Like what material is going to have the lowest impact? If it's recycling is not really the option, how can this product last longer, for example, or can we do something that biodegrades? It's looking at the whole ecosystem of product development and the use case to try to figure out a way that it's circular, that it's like cradle to grave. Like you don't have to worry about putting this product into the world. Like it's not going to have a negative effect.
Okay, I love that. I didn't know that I actually was a fan of circular design until you just described it. But this is certainly something that I believe in as well. Not necessarily my journey, so to say, hasn't necessarily been from a product standpoint, but it's maybe been from more of a I think about very often ecosystems of people and how that works and who we can work with and things like that. Can you tell me a little bit about why, of all the places in the world that you could go and do your research and, work in the uncomfortable and work in the gray and work, that you chose Japan? As much as, I totally appreciate Japanese design and the aesthetics of just sometimes how beautiful the Japanese culture is. Can you tell us a little bit about why, of all the places in the world or where you could go, that you chose Japan?
Well, it's part of it is choosing Japan, and part of it is also that Japan chose me.
That's common amongst a lot of us, isn't it?
Yeah. So for me, it's I don't want to get too political in these types of things, but I mean, I was born and raised in New York City, and I always felt that protected me from being American. But the last few years and the whole political cycle has gotten to a point where I'm just not really comfortable in my home country is one thing that drove me to seek opportunities elsewhere. But I lived here in Tokyo right after college when I was younger. I speak Japanese. It's my second language. It's fairly fluent, so it's makes
very
living
fluent.
here.
I've heard you presenting Japanese. It's very fluent.
So that's not a problem for me to live here. Like there's fewer cultural problems for me than for someone who just moves here like all of a sudden. But also my brand, when I did NOOKA, it was fairly well known in Japan. We had a lot of press in Japan in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, up until the demise. And so it was easier for me to find opportunities at the research level, university level, than it was in perhaps other geographies. And so I got, they offered me this professorship here at Keio University, and the timing was just such that I was like, oh yeah, maybe this is a good time to go back to Japan. It wasn't like my first, I was trying to get a position somewhere in Europe, but I ended up here. So that's the short or long version of the story.
No, I can imagine that's definitely the short version of the story.
But there's also in terms of like circular design, why Japan? Japan is, circular design, people think it sounds new, but it's actually a very old thing.
Absolutely,
people used to if you had watermelon, you used to not throw the rinds out, you would make pickles out of them, So, I mean, our grandparents used to do things like that. And I think Japan has a more of a continual culture of this type of using, at least food items and kintsugi and fixing things, and products having a more, even the laws about recycling, like not being, it's so difficult to throw, appliances out or furniture out. They make it so that you really have to think about, okay, what am I going to do with this in a circular sense? The vocabulary is changing, but I feel that Japan is a great place to explore those ideas. And also Japan is really rich in material science. There are so many companies doing amazing things in material science, and because it's a resource
poor country.
They've had to be much more innovative with in terms of things of efficiencies, for example, even in fields that, when they make certain types of threads for even synthetic fibers, the way that they're produced in Japanese factories with Japanese technology is much more sophisticated than in other countries, for example.
Yeah. You mentioned with circular design that Japan as a nation has, out of necessity, really had to adopt these efficient processes, especially when it comes to recycling and thinking about the product in, through the whole life cycle. And then when the initial function of the product maybe it expires, how can that product then, turn into something else, and things like that. But let's talk about innovation for a second. There are so many different views on innovation in Japan. One is, Japan is a rocket ship; it moves really fast. The other is Japan, no innovation. There's no ideas. Where do you sit on the Japan innovation spectrum? What's your view on it?
Well, I feel it's two parts. I think Japan, from a Japanese context, is definitely losing its edge with innovation. I think that the government could be doing a lot more to foster innovation. Because when you talk about innovation, we also have to talk about how do you, and this is a lot of the research I'm doing right now with my design lab, is how do you measure innovation? Like people, it's easier to measure success. Like you can say, oh, we made a lot more money, right? So I like, so there are clear metrics, but innovation, does it really, how many patents or trademarks have been filed? Is that a real valid measure of innovation? I mean, that's something that I think is worth exploring. Then with trademarks and with terms of technological innovation, is your company innovative just because you created the intellectual property, or are you more innovative because you figured out how to get it into the market, for example, right? So there's a lot of, it's such a buzzword, innovation, right? So I find that one of the problems with Japan is they get really, really obsessed with buzzwords. Like I remember in the 90s, everyone was talking about globalization in the 80s and 90s. And then, you had this like brief period in the late 90s where everything was about like the money culture, and then finance and VC investment culture. And then what did we have after that?
You were saying that it was globalization, monetization, and now it's innovation. Like that was the...
Well, before that, then there was design.
The Trinity.
Right. Then when you had design driven, which to me was a bit of a joke, that everyone was saying design driven companies and design driven businesses. So you had that for quite a while as well. And now it's innovation, like innovation. Well, of course, before that, in between design driven and innovation, you had in Japan, the, what was it called? Digital transformation.
Oh, digital DX.
Right. Yes, the digital transformation. So to focus on that also, I mean, Japan really is a little bit behind on all of these fronts. I mean, in terms of digital transformation, all the big companies have a digital transformation group, but they do it in a way that's not necessarily innovative. Like, for example, you'll have banks that will roll out their smartphone apps and their online banking, but they require you to use an FOB or some kind of a way to the systems to log in and to actually transact are so cumbersome that even my accountant he's a native Japanese accountant, and he can't figure out how to use the business banking apps for any of the accounts. That he says he has to do everything manually, because every time I try to log in, the server drops.
Doesn't work.
It just doesn't work. So it's there's a lot of motivation, but there's so much waste. There's so much money wasted in Japan for digital transformation and for real innovation. So to answer your question simply is, I do believe Japan is dropping the ball on innovation. I think, and again, back to what I started talking about, there's also a part of it where there's a segment of industry and society that's incredibly innovative, but because of cultural I don't want to call them problems, but because the culture is very difficult to get new ideas executed within companies, or if you're an individual, that a lot of really amazing ideas and innovation just like sits on in someone's head or on someone's computer, or even if it gets to the level of a patent, it doesn't get monetized, it doesn't get brought to market. There's not enough support behind innovative thinking. And I think a lot of Japanese innovators get quite frustrated, and they either stop or they move, and it just doesn't benefit society as a whole when that happens.
So when you said that Japan is dropping the ball a little bit, we mentioned also when I first connected with you about the kind of cultural pillars that in some ways hold up Japan as, the third largest economy in the world. And there's, many great things about the Japanese culture. But we also kind of, talked about, because you and I are really on the field kind of doing this work, different kinds of fields, but certainly, we're the ones that are on the floor, like listening to people, and we're seeing ideas being shut down, and we're trying to help them build up and things like that. This is not necessarily, pure academic work. We've seen it. And, we talked about these things like risk averse behaviors, things like diversity. So there are these kind of cultural pillars that kind of get in the way of innovation. Can you talk about what kind of those cultural pillars are? And is there anything we can do to either, work with them or navigate them or work around? Because what I've found is, to try to, reorganize or deconstruct the Japanese culture is next to an impossible task. So we've got to find workarounds, So what's for you in the lab work that you do? What are those things that you've identified that are, that are barriers to innovation? And, is there anything we can do about it, or is it shoganai? I hope not.
No, I think that a lot can be done. But it's also, it really goes back to, well, let's talk about the barriers. When we talk about diversity, even this week, with Abe announcing he's leaving, like one of the key policies that he said that he was going to make happen was increasing gender balance in Japanese society, right?
That's right.
And people are saying he failed at it. I mean, he moved the needle up. We have to give him some credit where credit is due. But even diversity in terms of like gender balance has been something that's so intractable in Japan. And I believe that this, it can only be approached through regulation. I don't think that, like Japan has never done major swings in cultural shifts without, gaiatsu, some kind of outside pressure, or with regulation from the government. When things are, so I think regulation can really help in this sense, in terms of gender balance. But this is where this discussion gets so complicated. Like, there's so many easy fixes that I don't understand why they don't do. One of the problems, people talk about gender balance in terms of like women in Japanese corporations, and you could talk about, but there's some really basic things that he said he was going to do they didn't do, like daycare. Like, this is a big problem in most in Japan and the US. Europe seems to have figured this out much better. Japan really needs to just push through a daycare bill, like, and make daycare available, and do it in a way that's not gendered. Like, you do it in a way that men can also decide to be, the parent, the stay-at-home parent, like all these things that you see in Northern Europe. And that has to be done on the government level. That has to be legislated. It has to be policy. And the other thing that is very strange, because the national health insurance is such a wonderful system in Japan, yet they don't cover childbirth. I mean, childbirth in Tokyo can be $30,000 US, between 30,000 and 60,000 US. So I actually know people. I've met people in their 20s who were born at home because their parents just didn't know how to navigate. They couldn't afford it. They didn't know how to navigate the reimbursement. It's just a very cumbersome thing. So for gender balance, just fix that.
Yeah, but also with like the declining birth rate as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Like we've got a declining birth rate. Which then leads into the issues of, okay, we don't have enough labor force. Well, what's those? What are those kind of like first things we can do? Okay, what else? I'm just having these like aha moments as the conversation goes along. So please forgive me. Continue.
Yeah,
what are the other ones?
No, but that's a very, very important one, and it's easy to fix on a policy level. And people start talking about it. There are a lot of fixes that are also on, when we're talking about policy, also the legal structure, the koseki system of, how you register your name and your family name is a very strong bias when we talk about increasing birth rate. There's a very strong cultural bias against children being born out of wedlock. And that could also be fixed. It could be fixed by, getting rid of this very ancient Confucius-based koseki system that Japan adopted from China. So that could happen. So I think that for gender imbalance, you have to attack that issue first. And the government doesn't talk about them together. They're talking about, we have to hire more female executives. And then they don't talk about, making childbirth free for everyone. The other issues that connected as one big overall, let's balance gender diversity. Let's, really work on gender diversity. And to me, that's something they can do. They absolutely can do. So then the other issues about diversity, again, without even with just in a Japanese context, this is a problem that that can be fixed in the Japanese context and benefit Japanese people. The diversity issue also, it gets very mixed up as well, because there aren't a lot of foreigners here, and the foreigners that are here are either very high level, like we are, hired at university or consultants, right? Or they're from Southeast Asia and they're working in the Nissan factory,
Right, and they're they're the hard labor force,
Exactly. So and that's an overgeneralization. There are people in the middle, but before we talk about that issue, they can increase productivity and innovation, I believe, by also, and diversity by also legislating LGBT rights. I mean, it's very, very difficult to be a gay person here in Japan. And
well, even to your point about having a child, or it's very difficult to have children out of wedlock. That's the assumption that parent, you have a female parent and you have a male parent as well. And so because marriage for a homosexual couple, I don't like to call it gay marriage because it's just marriage, marriage for couples of the same sex, because it's illegal still in Japan, that unless you find someone by chance with your last name, that's the only way really that your child is going to share the last name of both parents.
And it's easy to fix. It's easy to fix, and it's also something that, back to innovation, let's remember to tie everything back to innovation, that if you have more diversity, inspires a diversity of thought, and then you have more people coming up with more ideas. And if you look at the innovation economy, at least in a Western European, or if you look at the centers like New York or San Francisco or London or Berlin, these are all cities that have very, very vibrant gay communities, very free cultures that are free about how people identify, gender identity and whatnot. And especially on the gay marriage front, let's say, you look at the situation in the US, it's just politically and socially, it's getting more and more unstable every day. But if a company like Apple is thinking about, okay, maybe we're gonna move more of our designers or more of our innovators or our engineers overseas, they're not gonna pick a city that doesn't have gay marriage. They're not going to,
especially when they're CEO.
Yeah, their
himself is
CEO is
also,
openly gay
yeah.
man, exactly. So if you look at it purely as a business decision and to support innovation, I mean, I don't want to make some kind of statement without backing it up with data, but you know, anecdotally, you know, there's a disproportionate amount of LGBT people in the innovation industry, and if you're not going to support them and make them feel comfortable, and especially, I can't tell you how many people I know who they're here because they're, you know, they're gay couples. They're here because their spouse is here, but they have no legal right to stay here or work. You know, they have to really either leave and come back every 3 months. You're not going to attract these very, very high performance innovators if you don't match the social policies of the cities that have proven that they attract these types of workers.
Another thing that comes to my mind when you said that, if you lack emotional safety, security in the home, right? In the home, I find it incredibly difficult to show up and do your best work at the office or at your workplace or whatever that is for you. I can imagine if you're a couple of the same sex in Japan, and your husband or your wife every 3 months has to go somewhere just because so they can like get back in the country or whatever. I can imagine this is incredible turmoil. You know, we often see that the greatest innovation often comes from, I don't want to say people who live boring lives, but it's people who don't have to worry about anything else except the thing that they're doing. You know, if I don't have to worry about the visa of my husband or my wife, then I can completely be focused into my work. And that's where, you know, the different parts of my brain can be activated. I can imagine that without having this kind of policy that you mentioned, that we're not only preventing innovation in terms of, you know, just we don't have enough women or we don't have enough diversity or LGBT community representation, but I can just imagine that it's on a personal level, it's just so hard to show up and do your best work if you have all that other baggage.
Well, there's also another point about like truly innovative products or technologies. They're not developed in a short term as well. You like you said, you need to have this great a foundation and safety to develop something across it's generally a long time scale. And Japan seems to be very focused on measuring ROI in 1 year and 2 year time frames. And this is a relatively new development. It used to be much more long term. If you look at Japan in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And I don't know exactly what happened, but I believe it was because the government was trying to curtail what do you call that? Corruption. And by anyone that has access to budgets in a lot of the ministries, they started like cycling everyone to a new position every 2 years. And then the large corporations sort of followed this lead. And I find that, so you have this thinking that something has to be done in 2 years. But then back to this diversity issue and making people feel welcome and supported and welcome and supported. If you're constantly worrying about your spouse and you don't feel welcome in the country, you don't stay here that long. You don't have, I mean, Japan really needs people that are devoting more than 2 years of their time.
Yeah, we need decades. Yeah.
You need someone that's like, I want to contribute to this society 200%. And if you don't have policies or you have a legal structure that is hostile, and that's the interesting thing as well when we talk about like cultural diversity and immigrants, for example, not just LGBT. And when I said back to the original question about where's Japan moving on innovation, I feel that it's going down. Like we have the whole thing with Gon and that whole legal case against him. It just shows you that that foreigners, it's not just that, there's just enough things happening, whether it's LGBT or that business thing with Gon, that foreigners just don't really feel welcome here.
Well, it's a cocktail, isn't it? If we look at Gon, when was he gone? December or November? I forgot. It was November or December of last year.
I think it
And
was
then
November. Yeah. Yeah.
and then fast forward only 3 months, for example, to COVID. Japan then closed their borders to permanent residents or even visa holders. If you're a Japanese
Yeah.
citizen, and that means holding a passport, this is very different. If you're a business traveler or a tourist, I'm very sorry, but you're gonna have to wait. Like everybody else, no country really has a good hold on it. I'm originally Australian. Australia, also being an island nation, has the luxury of just closing their borders. They did the same thing. The only difference
Right.
was between, for example, what Australia did and what Japan did, is that they discriminated against if you're a visa holder versus a passport holder. And
Right.
whether you're a Japanese national. And so if you think about, well, there, as you mentioned, there's like the LGBT issues, and there's a Gon case, and then there's this, and then in March there's this, by the way, even if you've been living in Japan 20 years and you have permanent residency, you have a house here, you're still paying taxes here, you have a mortgage here, and you happen to be outside. It wasn't until the 1st of September, so being this month only 2 weeks ago, that you were allowed back in the country. This is where you start thinking, Japan, and you and I are Team Japan, which is why kind of we're having this conversation, you're like, this is not good image-wise, guys. Like, it's not good. And it kind of makes me think, and you mentioned policy, and it kind of, I hate to say this, but I almost feel like the reason that the kind of like foreigners were kind of discriminated against passport holders and citizens is because there was no policy. And what happens in Japan if there's no policy or there's no law? Nothing. We don't do anything, without kind of approaching something in an agile way and thinking about it like that.
But they actually made a policy that was discriminatory and xenophobic. I mean, that's a policy to not allow permanent residents in.
Absolutely.
In terms of international law that Japan has signed on, they have to treat their visa holders and their permanent residents as the same as citizens.
Yeah.
So
as you mentioned,
they made a conscious decision to be racist about it. There's just no way about it.
So what do we do? Because this is you and I are we are in the field of innovation. We want to see these things change. Policy is certainly one of them. Is there anything else that you're working on, or that you see that we can do while we're pushing for policy? Like I saw that there was quite a few people who wrote recommendations, like from the Chamber of Commerce. So there was the Australian New Zealand Chamber of Commerce. Actually, a previous podcast guest, Catherine O'Connell, she was actually one of the contributors to, I think that was from the American Chamber of Commerce. So if I'm not wrong, recommending the Japanese government to open up. Is there anything else that we can do? Because when I just think, okay, it has to be policy, I'm with you. I totally believe that. But I'm also thinking, what do we do in the meantime? Like as innovation professionals, what can we do?
Well, I think we're in a difficult position because Japan has, they've made it clear legally that even being a permanent resident, that you don't have the same legal protections of a Japanese citizen. So if you want to do something that might be perceived as political activism, then, but I think it's just about trying to, and I'm a little bit behind on this, but I think all of us in this community, we need to be writing more Japanese articles for Japanese press, like for, that are caged in a way, like you said earlier, that we are Team Japan, but the Japanese are so sensitive about anything that seems critical. You have this, the whole world is moving towards this, well, they're calling it popularism, but it's fascism, right? And Japan has never really ended their fascist state. The people they're governed by a fear of rocking the cradle, or a fear of, people here don't even want to get the attention of the government. I mean, it's such a bizarre political environment to be. So I think that it has to be, we have to do more. Right now there's no voice, there are very few voices in the middle. You have some people that write in Japanese and English on the press, but they're perceived by the Japanese as being very overly argumentative or anti-Japan, even though they're also Team Japan. You know, like you have, what is it, Debito?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have these people that really are writing amazing articles and doing really good petitions, but their perception in the Japanese press is not, they're not really embraced by them, you know? So I think that people like you and I need to find, how do we find that voice that's going to appeal to a Japanese person and open them up? But it does bring up another question that I'd like to ask you then is like,
Oh gosh, yeah.
Like, for example, we talked a little bit about in the beginning that Japan got really obsessed with globalization and monetization, and now it's innovation and digital transformation.
Yeah.
Is it just PR, or are Japanese companies and Japanese people truly, is it truly their goal? Do they really want, like you talked about globalization in the 80s and 90s, and Japanese companies didn't really globalize. They talk about diversity. Yeah. And you can look at the diversity programs at the large Japanese companies, and they have the diversity programs, like they'll have an LGBT like employee group, but they don't have any active participation. Like they don't really follow through. They go through the motions, but they don't really, you know, follow through with actually enacting the policies. And same like with the government with the gender balance. So I'm really starting to question, like, do you really feel companies, are they really interested in innovation, or are they happy with the economy shrinking? Like they're like, we print our own money.
I know. So for me, I'm gonna go yes and. I'm gonna go, is it PR? Yes and. Okay. So is it PR? Yes. Innovation. So firstly, it's a katakana word, so that tells you as much as you need to know about how deeply the Japanese feel connected with the word innovation. For me, there's two kinds of innovators, and you will be surprised, or I was surprised, as to which companies I felt that had a deeper commitment to innovation. If you are a multinational and you have your, not if your headquarters in Japan, but if you have like a daughter company in Japan and the headquarters abroad, innovation certainly is more of a PR buzzword. We have to keep our numbers up, business driven kind of thing. No question, in my experience. However, this is kind of what blew my mind. Was I was in an office of a Japanese company, 250 years old, and they said to me, Brittany-san, we don't have any good ideas. And I said, what do you mean you don't have any good ideas? Of course we have good ideas, and of course we use design thinking and a methodology in order to get some ideas. And then what we kind of recognized was, it's not, they don't have an idea problem. They have a, oh my gosh, I don't want to be the idiot to bankrupt a 250-year-old company problem. And the Japanese companies that have deeper history and that have a deeper commitment to their employees are more invested in innovation, in my opinion, hands down. However, they don't know what to do or how to go about it, which gets back to your point of creating content in Japanese, which is what I try to do as much as I can as well. And so for me, there's these two kinds of companies. There's these, I'm doing it for PR, and then there's the other side, which are really the traditional Japanese companies that are saying, we can't keep up at the rate that we are, and we don't, and it's not even that they don't want to let their business down, they don't want to let their people down. And I found that interesting.
Yeah. But then, so the bigger companies, I mean, that's my question. Like, they have these innovation groups, like with my clients, and it does seem to me that there's a lot of great innovation happening in the group, but even what you described, if they can't execute,
right,
it's that if a tree falls in the forest, doesn't make a noise, doesn't make a sound, you know, it's like, so you have to really, I have to really question, are the upper brass or the executives, are they really committed to it? Is the government committed to it?
And I think it's really depends on the company, but there's two kinds of Japanese leaders that are kind of like 55 to 65. One is, I'm just gonna sail. I'm gonna sail till till I retire, and then hopefully I'll get a position at some kind of government job, and that'll be great. The others that are saying, you know what, I've proved myself enough now, and I'm gonna go and I'm gonna make a ruckus, and I'm gonna make a legacy. And there are more and more of this second type of Japanese leader, really, which brings me to another point of yours that you believe essential to innovation, which is finding your voice. And it's not necessarily only about foreigners finding their voice. How do we find our voices, but also how do Japanese people find their voices? What's the role of finding your voice and then using it in the environment of innovation in Japan?
Well, I find that, and it's not just a Japan thing, it's an Asian thing, because my students are from all over the world, and I've been teaching for many, many years, as well as doing my own products and design work and consulting. And in Japan, people are so trained to not express their voice that it's very difficult for them to even find it. You know, so if you can't find your voice and there's a time and a place for research and a time and a place for analysis, but in order to really have innovation, you have to have some type of creative spark as well, so, and a lot of times, or a point of view, like you have to have, if you don't have your own personal point of view, if it's not your own voice, it's very, very difficult to sell the idea passionately and give it form. So to me, it's all part of how to get ideas out and to get team members on board and actually execute innovation, and also to articulate innovation. So if you don't find your voice, you're not really, your new ideas, your own ideas, the unique ideas are not being expressed. You're just working with what you've researched, or what you think the expectations of the bosses or the market or the demographics. So that's why I think for people to connect to their own voice and their own experience, then especially in service design or product design, they're going to find a much more innovation, basically. And it's hard because it's kind of like it's psychological. You're getting into people's psychology then.
And then it also comes back down to the issue of diversity. Not only do we need different voices, but we also need people that are already there also to speak up.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's almost this kind of, and it's funny that this, kind of, circles back, but it's, innovation as part of this, this collaborative process. It's not about, one person having the idea and then developing it in a design sprint, as much as I think, design sprints are great, but really that kind of structural, innovation that that we're really going for does take time. So we need not only new voices or different voices and diverse ideas, because diversity can also be just a group of Japanese nationals that have different ideas, but they feel comfortable enough.
Of course. Yeah. Well, and also back to voice and back to linguistics, for example, a lot of people have ideas, but they can't articulate them particularly well. So it's I always try to, like when I do my workshops, especially for innovation, that, it's one thing to be able to draw an idea or to explain it perhaps, but if you can't turn it into a narrative, then it doesn't give it any reality. I mean, humans, we experience things as in context of, whether it's cultural context or a use case scenario. And so that's why I think it's really important to find the voice. And that's how, you get an idea that's just going to sit in someone's brain, and one that, a lot of, also when we were talking about how to measure innovation, like you look at these annual lists that people put out, most innovative companies in the world. And it's, again, it's like, how are they measuring it? Are they measuring true innovation, or are they just measuring sales? It's,
the voice is to innovation what the product is to circular design. Like it's the thing that builds the narrative. It's the thing that kind of ties it all together and helps it give meaning.
It's and it's also, while back, it's important that when you're talking about, like, for example, just business processes and competition, companies are now, they're not really competing on features and design anymore. They really are competing in this narrative space. The value is created in the storytelling. So I believe the voice and the storytelling is almost as important to the products and to innovation as technological innovation, for example.
How have you found telling a story in Japan? Is it more or less the same as you would tell a story somewhere else, like to a foreign brand or to an international brand? Or how is the storytelling experience, or how's your experience been in storytelling for you in Japan?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think that's another important point for why Japan seems to be slipping in innovation on different fields, because they're not really a lot of people get it. You know, there are Japanese companies that really, you have a lot of people in Japan that say, oh, well, this is our culture, this is the way we do things. But then you have all these examples of Japanese consumers really responding very positively to the foreign model, for example. So, you know, Apple is successful in every single market they enter, and they don't alter the narrative. The narrative is the same.
Right.
They're competing not on the features, they're competing on brand. It's brand storytelling, right? So Japan, and back to like helping Japanese people find their voice, trying to tie this all together, is Japanese people are trained to be very good at describing something. So like they like to focus on the features of a product, for example, or how it looks or what it does. And America and the West has given up this. They know that we're entering a world where it's product parity. Like cars have had product parity for a very long time. You know, they have four wheels, they have similar engines, similar, the human body hasn't evolved. So the shape of the seats, you know, you could say that cars each brand has unique designs, but they kind of look the same, and functionally they're similar products. So you have to appeal through storytelling and through brand. And Japanese car companies get it, you know, but you know, the Japanese technology companies, they didn't get it. They dropped the ball. Like if you look at Sony could have been Apple, you know?
But in the MP3, they had MP3 players, right? So before we had the MP3 music as data, we had, you know, in an iPod, we had MP3 players in Japan.
Yeah, or Docomo could have been Apple. Do you know what I'm saying? Like there were all these examples we can point to where Japan actually was more innovative before other companies took it. Mixi was so much more sophisticated than any social media product in the West at the time. But because they're so focused on the features and not on the narrative, they think that, well, you know, this is great, we're going to add more features, or this is working. So they don't really, they don't have a vision. They're really stuck in, they think more like engineers. So in this sense, that there needs to be more work on that. You know, like TV commercials in Japan, like I just hate watching Japanese television. They're not innovative. They're not creative, you know? Yeah. They're just, so you might have to repeat the question again to bring me back, because I think
that's perfect, and all those changes are super relevant. Which you have finished a few of your presentations saying that the only place that we're all going is the future, right? Mm-hmm. So what is that? You know, you mentioned that, for example, some of your work is doing research into, you know, the correlation between green space and innovation and, mm-hmm. things like that. If the only place that we're all going is the future, what does your design lab tell us what that might look like, or what kind of a future should we, try to build?
Well, I think we're at a very important point in history where it seems like we're not going in the right direction, but a lot of things are. So in the 90s, technologists were talking about convergence, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people talking about convergence tends to get quasi-religious with the singularity, for example, right? That we're all going to become this mind body or this computer mind and whatnot. Mm-hmm. I think that's a little bit the Matrix thing. I think we're seeing that is a dystopian possibility of our future, definitely. But I do believe that that we're going to have to move to a more so a couple of things. I think if we move in the right direction, in the positive direction, we're going to live in a future where we all have more access to nature and we all have more access to art. I think that one of the common threads that I find in the research I'm doing with innovators, when people are innovative, is the amount of art they're exposed to, whether it's music of any genre or art shows or events. We didn't talk about some other things in Japan about access to psychedelics and marijuana, but That's
Oh my
another
gosh,
issue.
that's episode.
But
That's yeah. Matthew comes
an
back
episode in and of
2.0.
itself, right? But I believe that the future is that we're going to have more access to things that stimulate the mind in an artistic way, and that this is how you're going to create a mental environment that people are truly innovative, that you have this and more diversity. And I think that in terms of resources with convergence, we've already seen, and to me, it all ties into circular economy as well. You know, when I was a kid, the things that you wanted were really physical objects. You wanted a stereo deck, you know, stereo player, you wanted the cassette deck, you wanted the turntable, you wanted really big speakers. And as technology has brought convergence with like music and MP3 and digitization, that we only need our smartphones, then your carbon footprint in terms of your physical products you consume is lower per person, right? But now we have more and more people like, around the world entering, you know, middle-class society. So more people are buying even more of these things. So we need to have more of a circular design thinking about actually mitigating and lowering everybody's footprint, everyone's environmental footprint. And convergence of technology definitely helps that, because the fewer products you need. I think one of the most wonderful things about the Corona and the COVID lockdown, which has been horrible, I'm not happy about it, but I think it's also showing people that you do need less things. Like I've been living with 3 t-shirts and 3 pairs of underwear for months and it's fine, you know?
And no shoes, no shoes or handbags for me.
And no shoes, exactly. I have a closet full of sneakers, like ridiculous. So I think that we are seeing that we're moving towards this world where we have less physical things, and that's going to require a revolution in material science. We need to create things that are, you know, there's a wonderful company in Japan called Spiber. They do genetically engineered fibers from the DNA of spiders and spider silk. So there is a way to converge organic and tech and get to a point where each of us has more stimulation, more culture, more interaction, but a less of an impact on the environment. And right now, the negative things that we have to overcome is, you know, curtailing people's travel because of a pandemic is one thing, but we should be able to use this as an opportunity to see that we need to reinvent travel to be a lower impact on the environment. You know, so there's wonderful opportunities. I think this, all these negative things we're experiencing now, if the governments don't take it as an opportunity to really grab the moment and bring us to the future, then I think we might not reach that utopian goal. But I really do believe that we're going to be in a world where we have fewer things. We'll have nice places to live, and we'll still have nice things. But I think the material science is going to develop to the point that we have, and technology, that we have more access to culture and to each other. Right now, the isolation is bad. Isolation is not good for innovation and not good for ideation. So, so I'm optimistic. I think we might have a couple of stumbling blocks, but I think that a future with I think technology. I think biotech and technology hasn't converged in the way that I'd like to see. I know that people are talking about how implants are bad, but yeah, they could be. But I think they could also be really positive in terms of like when you have less material to make something that's very high impact, you have a lower impact on the environment. So, I apologize if I went off on a tangent.
No, there's absolutely no such thing as a tangent on the Business Karaoke podcast. This is what we're all about. And I think just to kind of reflect on just kind of the conversation we've had over the last hour, I appreciate your thoughts so much, because the thing that for me, if we're talking about innovation and we're talking about a voice, one of the things that's that I'm kind of learning as well is how to use my voice to contribute to innovation as well, and how can people like you and I, which have an appreciation for global innovation, have appreciation for the global kind of culture about how things can be different and things like that. But also we have an equal appreciation for the Japanese language and culture, and how can we, contribute. Not only, it's not a one-way street. Obviously, there's many things that I've learned in Japan that I certainly bring with me in when I'm, abroad and kind of in my global communities. There's many things that I really love about Japanese culture that I have embodied as a person, that I really like, that I own it. But at the same time, I'm very much looking forward to bringing what I've seen abroad, things like, as you mentioned, policy. I lived in Germany for 8 years. So in terms of policy that you were talking about, maternity leave and paternity leave, that firstly, there's even two words you mentioned. I know you're passionate about language and linguistics. There's even two kinds of, it's even, and then parental leave. So it's not only maternity leave. They refer to it as parental leave because you're a parent.
And that's back to language, how the words are important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And this is, to your point of linguistics, so that, helps, not only shape our thoughts and our future ideas, but also shows our bias as well. If we call it maternity leave, well, that's an assumption, isn't it? Because it means that maybe I'm the mother. What about a father? What happens if maybe I'm not the mother or the father, but I'm the parent of the child? Like there's a whole nother, there's so many different situations. And and I guess I'm learning how to use my voice to contribute to the innovation dialogue, and I appreciate so much the maturity of this conversation that you encouraged, certainly me, and I know also the listeners, to to move beyond, which is certainly something that I love to do, is to move beyond the, if you're doing business in Japan, make sure you bring your meishi. Yeah, okay, thanks, that was a 1982 textbook, we're done with that. Like, I'm so thankful for this kind of mature, advanced conversation around innovation in Japan, because I think the more that we talk about it, the more we understand it. The more that we understand it, I think the better we can empathize with it, and then therefore have some kind of plan for change or growth. So I couldn't be more thankful for your time.
Yeah, and that's I love that you brought that up with the word parental leave. It's such an important point, because a lot of things with Japanese policy as well are linguistic.
Gaikokujin, out of sight of this country person,
well,
foreign alien.
No, but even on the gender spectrum, that prostitution is illegal only for women. It's not illegal for men. Because the word in the legal document, in the legal structure, is baishunfu. So it's this female gendered word. So male prostitution is not illegal. That's why when you go to Kabukicho, you have all these posters for the host bars. So for people who want to use a female, they have to go through the shokaijo, and they have to use all these convoluted ways, and you have all these really interesting Japanese cultural things, like being paid with a Prada bag and not with money. But if you want, a male prostitute, it's totally just, you give cash, and it's totally legal, because the words in the law are gendered. So language, back to linguistics, it's very important. So the whole thing about legalizing prostitution in Japan, it always gets stuck, because they get into this argument, well, do we want to just remove the gender and make it illegal for everyone, or do we want to remove the gender and make it legal for everyone? And it gets stuck on this complex gendered conversation, which is really interesting. And the whole thing with parental leave, I think it's amazing that Germany said it's parental leave. It's not maternity leave. It's not paternity leave. And that's really important.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate so much. And you have left me with 1,000 more questions that I need to ask you, specifically around psychedelics in Japan. Matthew Waldman on the Business Karaoke Podcast, episode 2.0. So I'm really, really thank you so much for your time. And I can't wait for you to come back and talk about maybe these other crazy things.
Yeah, and if anyone's watching and wants to know, well, if you don't need a meishi now, you don't need a business card, we have to tell everyone that you have to have a Facebook account that you're comfortable using for business or a
Oh
line account
gosh. Yeah, yeah,
when you come to
absolutely.
Japan.
Yeah. Welcome. This is your client. First thing, you know, you leave the meeting. First thing, boom, Facebook request. Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
And then I've
yeah, it
even seen
is.
foreigners be like, I'm sorry, this is for only friends or family. If you're a foreigner in Japan, you have a Facebook account and you say, I'm sorry, it's only for friends and family. No, you cannot. It doesn't work. The only option there is that you have to open a second account. You have to open a
Exactly. Yeah.
second account and a professional account, and then, you know, you can split your vacation photos with like your I don't know, articles or whatever. But you
Oh,
can't get around it.
I am, I am shocked how much business like like gets done on Facebook Messenger. It's like,
Oh yeah,
can you
don't use
send
email
like
anymore. Yeah, can you send? Yeah,
I'm-
don't use email.
I
Use
always tell
Facebook
people, I
Messenger.
know
What the hell?
yeah, I need the email, otherwise it doesn't get in the calendar.
Yeah, it doesn't
It's-
exist for me. Come on, guys. Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh.
yeah, but like you said, that's another topic. But thank you for allowing me to ramble on today like
No, it
this.
was my absolute pleasure. I
Yeah.
cannot wait to schedule our next ramble.